Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Darren Marl. I head up the account management team at PFH. And welcome to today's webinar with Procurement for Housing, hosted by Ridge and Partners LLP. So we're going to take you through the practical implications of the Building Safety Bill and how it could impact you as a social housing landlord. The great news is we've maxed out our Zoom allocation of 100 attendees, so clearly an important topic, and a big thank you to all of you for giving up some of your valuable time to attend. If I could just take a few moments just to outline a few points before I introduce our first speaker. Firstly, the session is being recorded and you will each receive an emailed link to view it again following the event. We have two speakers followed by a Q&A at the end to hopefully answer any questions you may have. If you just move your mouse, you'll see the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you can please use that during the session, and we'll try our best to answer as many as possible within our allocated time. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce our first and key speaker, Mark Asbury, a partner at Ridge and Partners, who has over 25 years experience in the property and construction industry. He is a chartered building surveyor, a fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and a chartered member of CIH. Mark is responsible for the operational running of the property consultancy team, who are heavily involved with lots of housing associations and local authorities, and as you can imagine, very active at the moment, providing advice on both building and fire safety. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking some time out to have a listen to this presentation, which I hope you will find is practical and helps you in addressing one of several issues and challenges we have within the sector as asset managers. I will just outline in terms of the aspects that I'm going to cover today. A very brief introduction to Ridge, just in terms of what we do and where we're based, etc. The main thrust of the webinar is not to talk about the draft bill itself, which is frighteningly almost a year now since that came out, July last year, but just to give a recap and a bit of context for that. The focus really is on the practicalities and how we and other RSLs are approaching the requirements of the draft bill. So I've split, as you can see from the agenda, into a number of sort of categories, just to sort of compartment our approaches, etc. So it's really around sort of practical steps, how we're helping others, and hopefully give you some insight into how to tackle the challenge. I don't tend to read slides, so if there are any questions around on the slide, then as we said, we'll deal with those at the end, and hopefully I've avoided any abbreviations, etc., that you may have querying, but I'll try and expand on those as we go. And as I said, we'll have time for questions at the end. So that's the agenda. As said, our property consultancy team, 95% of what we do is in the affordable housing sector. We are part of a larger organisation in terms of Ridge. It's probably quicker to say what we don't do as a discipline, and that's probably just valuation work. So we do everything else. As you can see, large number of offices around the UK, and the services there very specifically identifying those that are particularly relevant to fire safety, but we're also heavily involved in things like net zero carbon, PAS 2035, retrofit coordinators and assessors, etc. So yes, a lot going on at the moment, and including things like our BIM management team, etc., on current projects, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So enough about Ridge for now. In terms of the draft building safety bill, as I said, just a sort of a bit of a recap there. So just the statement that was made by Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and just really highlighting in that statement some of the sort of key words there about the bill, obviously in response to Grenfell in 2017, the Hackett report that followed that, and obviously this draft bill, and also remembering that there's also the Fire Safety Act as it is now. So quite a few aspects to consider around building safety and those specific requirements in terms of the bill. The draft bill itself, as you probably know, as it's been out for some time now, probably seen as one of the largest overhauls in the industry in terms of safety in probably 40 years or so. Quite a large document in terms of about 334 pages, 150 pages of guidance, etc. And quite a dramatic impact potentially on building owners and leaseholders, while still keeping within the legislative framework other aspects of health and safety, such as the Health and Safety at Work Act, CDM, etc. So that large overhaul, then a number of key aspects within that draft building safety bill, which are listed there. More recently, you will have seen that Peter Baker, pictured at the bottom of that slide there, has taken up the role of Chief Inspector of Buildings. So we'll be taking forward the establishment and running of the Building Safety Regulator. So he was Director of Building Safety and Construction previously, so comes with I think 30 to 40 years experience in the sector. So I think was generally welcomed as a very good appointment. He's anticipating needing to recruit about 700 staff, which is probably no great surprise given the scope and anticipated role of the regulator, and also bearing in mind that the impact, whilst geared initially to new residential multi-occupied high-rise buildings, will expand to include other types of buildings, etc. So potential impact immediately on 13,000-ish odd buildings in England. So obviously a very wide remit, and as well as the new build challenges, obviously for us in the sector and those of us who are sort of in the asset management world, it's that existing legacy portfolio of higher risk buildings that obviously is a significant challenge. Obviously, the key focus of the draft building safety bill, building on from the Hackett report, etc., is that ensuring that residents will be safer in their homes, and learning those lessons from Grenfell and the resulting inquiry, in terms of listening to residents, giving them that voice and platform to be able to air concerns, etc. The draft bill also sees fairly wholesale regulatory reform of building control in England, particularly for higher risk buildings where the building safety regulator will become the building control authority. Other aspects covered under those amendments to the Building Act, including the registration and keeping a log of building control. And certainly for high risk buildings, that's going to remove that option that developers have had in the past in terms of whether they elect for local authority or approved inspectors. They will have to deal with the building safety regulator. You'll have also seen within the draft bill those accountable persons for in occupation responsibilities, and I'll talk a bit about that in terms of obviously the appointments of things like building safety managers, and that the requirements in terms of competency, which are also partly covered in the Building Act amendments. Other aspects there in terms of that draft building safety bill you're probably quite fully aware of in terms of the sanctions, potentially quite significant, particularly if they're linked to the same sorts of provisions within the corporate manslaughter legislation, and that establishment of that ombudsman scheme. But also recognising resident responsibilities in terms of allowing access and how they use their properties, etc. So that's very quickly a presentation that normally takes you 45 minutes in terms of the background to the Building Safety Bill, but I'm taking it as read, as most on this call will know about the background. So let's move on. In terms of timetable, again, it's currently sat within that pre-legislative scrutiny before being introduced to Parliament, which is expected during this year, albeit obviously there is a fair amount going on with other aspects, not least of which is COVID. But that's the sort of current timetable. There has been, in terms of the scrutiny by the Housing Communities and Local Government Committee, criticism regarding the lack of detail, despite the length of the bill, in terms of detail within it, and also reliance on secondary legislation. So there is a lot to do, and I think Peter Baker, in taking up his new role, said that it's probably 18 months, 2 years sort of timescale before the act will become sort of fully applicable in the sector. So I think we're anticipating it would apply to new buildings fairly quickly, but we wait to see what that transition period would be for existing buildings. But more on that in a moment. Obviously, the Grenfell inquiry has been slowed down by the pandemic, and that sort of recess that had to occur with the second phase looking at the causes of the fire. So that inquiry will continue into this year, and it's unlikely the phase 2 report will be published until next year. Again, as I said, the criticism is really aimed at providing more detail and information, so that as an industry, construction industry, and as a sector in terms of housing, we have more information to be able to plan with greater certainty for this new regime. And the committee suggested that greater clarity provided on when the new regime will come into effect via secondary legislation, as opposed to simply when this draft bill becomes an act of Parliament. So that's the sort of timescales. I think generally in recognition of what Dame Judith Hackett has said, we aren't sitting around waiting for the bill to become an act of Parliament, and indeed for other secondary legislation to come into place. We're looking at the potential issues and risks, and what we need to be doing now, and that's in accordance with the statement made by Dame Judith Hackett. So effectively, don't wait, it is urgent, and it needs that commitment. So moving into in terms of the implications of the draft bill, I've split these, as I mentioned at the outset, into sort of a number of different areas. The first and foremost is people, and that's both people within housing providing organisations, so housing associations, councils, ALMOs, TMOs, etc. It's making sure that, as with any sort of compliance risk area, whether you're talking about asbestos, gas, etc., there needs to be that education within your teams about that risk area, in this case fire, and the impact of this bill. I think it's been well documented, and as Dame Judith Hackett said, about the cultural shift required within the industry generally, and the offers in terms of signing up to the Building Safer Future charters, etc. So that those first things are all really around understanding what's in the bill, how that's going to impact your respective organisations, and how your team and colleagues are impacted by that bill, and what roles and responsibilities and interdependencies with other members of your team and externally, how that's going to impact them, and understanding those. So again, yeah, in terms of who the stakeholders in this are broad ranging and include obviously residents. In terms of those aspects around governance, etc., I think we can expect to be audited and reviewed in terms of how transparent information flow is between teams, and how that is reported up to whether it's cabinets or executive teams or boards, etc. and ensuring that those aspects are captured and encapsulated within relevant organisation management plans and procedures relating to fire safety. Obviously, in terms of governance and regulator for social housing assessments, this could be obviously an area where, if lacking, could see governance downgrades. So it is an important aspect to make sure is understood and articulated within an organisation in response to the bill. In terms of the those appointing duty holders, they must ensure that all those appointees and prescribed persons meet and demonstrate competency requirements, and the accountable person responsible in terms of in occupation. So once the building is occupied, so for the majority of us, most of the existing assets obviously will already be occupied, but that appointment of a building safety manager who will be responsible for the day-to-day management of fire and structural safety in the building. So obviously, in terms of people and training, understanding who that accountable person may be, individual, corporate entity, there's various possible positions that could be appointed to that post, but also understanding, the need for building safety managers and getting the right level of competency to undertake that task, more of which a bit later. So I think the key thing from the training, very much like other parts of compliance that we look at, is making sure that we have the right people in the right positions and they have the right understanding, training and skills to deal with those aspects of the bill which are applicable to them, but also have a greater understanding in terms of the wider picture and how they fit into that. So quite important. The other impacts in terms of people and training requirements, also we need to think about the supply chain, and particularly for sort of projects, new build or refurbishment projects, etc. Those responsibilities of key roles outlined on the slide. As I mentioned, in terms of high risk buildings, the building safety regulator will become the building inspector for those, but certainly going forward for other types of high risk buildings, we will need to make sure that we are utilising building control inspectors that are on that regulator's sort of approved list and schedule that they are proposing to put together. There's also within the expectations, the likes of principal designers, principal contractors, their requirements to review refurbishment and new build works as far as design and occupation is concerned. So particularly in terms of the gateway process, gateway 2, which is the end of RIBA stage 4 design, signing off and providing that certification that designs are suitable and have taken into account fire and structural safety matters. And then again at gateway 3, which is the end of the construction phases, so RIBA stages 5 to 7, that again those certificates are provided with showing adherence to formal safety sort of sign off to ensure that they are fit for occupation. So for those individuals undertaking those types of role, the impact of the draft bill is quite important for them to understand in terms of potentially what additional tasks and data and information requirements are going to be required, particularly in respect of high risk buildings. So that therefore needs a review of their terms of appointment, their scope of works, and another point which I'll return to in terms of do they have adequate professional indemnity insurance, etc., which we are already seeing some impacts on, as I'll come to in a moment, and that they will, as individuals, have important roles and provision of information to support the building safety case reports, which we'll talk about in a moment. So again, it's important that either those people within your own organisations that are undertaking those types of roles, if you've got planned works delivery teams, etc., but probably also in terms of externally appointed consultants, contractors, etc., making sure that we are thinking about those sorts of things now, so that we don't inherit an issue further down the line when we are forced to prepare and provide information in terms of getting the assurance certificates that are required. The next aspect in terms of impact I've just highlighted here is really on the strategy related information, so updating particularly fire strategies and related strategic management plans, procedures, processes, etc. So we typically expect and have been preparing and updating fire strategies for individual buildings to understand how all different elements in the buildings work together, and setting out all the different elements and why certain systems and measures might not be required or could be installed. So what we were doing in terms of fire safety, do you need sprinkler systems, and if you don't, what other measures do you put in place to provide the adequate levels of safety that are required? But I think the key thing is, and as we've already started doing, is making sure that particularly strategic management plans are reflective of those changes that we anticipate as a result of the bill, particularly where clients have higher risk buildings. And at the moment, whilst that's defined as the high-rise 18 meters, 6-story plus type buildings, let's not forget that it's within the Secretary of State's prescribed rights to include other types of buildings. So, we are currently looking at higher risk multi-occupied buildings such as sheltered schemes, extra care schemes, etc., where whilst not high, they are still complex and have high risk issues. So again, looking at those as well. In terms of the building regulations, you'll be aware that the building regs updates happened in 2020. So there were various changes in there, including the height threshold for provision of sprinklers being reduced from 30 meters down to 11 meters. Continued acceptance to continue recommending a sprinkler system in flats, but not necessarily in common areas where they're sort of fire sterile, lack of combustible materials, etc. Those building regs update also included new guidance, consistency and wayfinders signage, etc., for the fire service for certain heights and types of buildings. As you're probably also aware, the Fire Safety Act 2021 came into force on the 19th of March this year as well, so providing that further clarity around the regulatory reform Fire Safety Order 2005 for multi-occupied buildings of any height. And this was providing that clarity about who is responsible for managing, reducing fire risk in multi-occupied residential buildings, and critically including external wall cladding common areas. So contained within it requirements for regular inspection of lifts and the reporting of results to the local fire and rescue services, ensuring evacuation plans are reviewed and regularly updated, and personal evacuation plans are in place for residents whose ability to evacuate may be compromised. Also ensuring fire safety instructions provided to residents in a form that they can reasonably be expected to understand, and there's a sort of linkage, as I'll come on to, in terms of the white paper and the need to be resident centric, and ensuring its information is provided in the right type of format. And finally, on the Fire Safety Act is that individual flat entrance doors where the external walls of a building have unsafe cladding to comply with current standards. And again, something that we've been heavily involved with our BRE fire door inspectors in terms of assessing doors and ensuring that they are fit for purpose in terms of fire resistance, etc. In terms of the social housing white paper and links into that, obviously the charter there is aimed at putting residents at the heart of building safety. So I think we've seen sort of further implementation of those requirements from the Hackett review in terms of listening and taking account of what residents are saying, but further development of that within that social housing white paper, including how the residents are engaged with. So the days of purely just sort of sending letters or posting things on the website or providing out newsletters, etc. Obviously, we, particularly over the last 14 months, have been using a multitude of different ways of engaging with residents when COVID has prevented the sort of face-to-face type engagement. But it's making sure that the engagement is fit for the profile of residents and their differing needs. It's not one size fits all, and ensuring it is effective and tailored to their requirements. As the draft bill includes, the building safety regulator has that responsibility for 3 committees that are required around construction, technology excellence, materials, etc., but also the residents panel. Within the draft bills, also that requirement for that resident consultation strategy to be prepared as part of the provisions required for a building occupation certificate. But other things that might need to be looked at, quite a few clients have handbooks for residents, etc. So clearly updating those with fire safety related information, what type of information is going to be made available, what format, etc. But also those requirements which the draft bill excuse me, will bring into place in terms of the updates to the Landlord and Tenant Act, and those express duties being placed on residents of high-risk buildings, so keeping their properties in good repair, cooperating with the building safety managers so they can fulfil their building safety duties, not hindering or damaging fire safety works or equipment, and also letting them know, obviously, that the accountable person will have rights to enter their properties and issue enforcement notices if necessary via the courts in order to be able to undertake and discharge their duties and undertake works that are required. The final point there is also all this information is all very well and good, but it's that accountability as well for a housing provider in terms of how effective and are they actually undertaking and doing what they said they're going to do as well. So there is that within the white paper as well. In terms of other sort of issues and challenges that certainly we are facing, and that I think our sector will face generally, the building safety manager role, I've seen proposals that we take the caretaker, change their job description and call them a building safety manager, which we've obviously advised maybe not quite in the spirit of what's anticipated. There are specific competency guidelines that are available now, but obviously that building safety manager is quite a sort of unique skill set in terms of an understanding of technically how a building and its safety, both fire and structural, works. So it's almost FM plus, but also having that responsibility in terms of resident engagement. So not necessarily that a building safety manager is a single individual. You may have aspects of the building safety manager role undertaken by more than one person, but what is certainly evident in the marketplace at the moment is the availability and the skills within both the industry and the housing sector. Is there's not a large pool of resources that necessarily fit this type of role at the moment. So obviously, there is going to be that skill shortage. So there may be need for, or there will be need for training. It might be taking individuals with some of those core skills and providing further coaching and training to be able to undertake this type of role. Other aspects I've mentioned, the scrutiny committees, etc., and the reliance on secondary legislation. So until that's sort of come down the line and published, again, there is that lack of a sort of detail there. So at the moment we're anticipating what that would be, but until that comes out and is published, we won't know for sure. Other aspects generally around fire safety, fire related works, obviously the issues around EWS1s and the ability of surveying practices and others being able to produce those. There have been significant changes in professional indemnity insurance requirements and what brokers are requiring consultancies, etc., to do and not do. So there are limits in terms of PI insurance caps that have been put on certain policies, etc. So there is a need to understand how the insurance industry is reacting to this, and particularly, where this may put constraints on certain types of consultancies, etc. So I think the word is there, when employing consultants, etc., to do fire safety related work, do make sure they have the appropriate PII levels, and you may find those levels are not quite as high as ideally you may want. So it's just making sure that you have got consultants with the right levels of insurance and cover, and they can undertake tasks that need doing. I mentioned the Fire Safety Act already in terms of when that came into force. One of the big issues around that, certainly almost as soon as it was issued, was in terms of leaseholders and the absence of any sort of recourse that they may have to help with the costs of fire safety improvement work. So particularly those facing sort of large bills, etc., for modification or renewal work being done to ensure that their buildings are safe. So there wasn't the sort of anticipated or hoped for rather provisions that leaseholders might be able to rely on in terms of lessening that burden of having to pay a proportion of the costs incurred by the landlord. That was indeed enough to cause a fairly large revolt by members of the Conservative Party, but the legislation still went through. But it's still very much an issue that not necessarily got a full answer to it yet. The final aspect we've come across is certainly around product testing. Clarity around that, and getting the confidence in terms of certification, etc., for certain types of materials, and making sure that going forward, we're not using unsuitable types of cladding or insulation materials. In terms of the next sort of area I was going to look at is really around the data. So as I mentioned, building safety case reports and templates. In terms of the application for the building assurance certificate, which was previously known as the building safety certificate, this must be accompanied by a safety case report for each building, and provide information that the regulator can then assess. So in terms of what do we do next, it's really about the analysis and identification within your respective portfolios of where those high risk buildings are, certainly in terms of current definitions, but also high risk ones that I've talked about already. Looking at the potential gaps in that information, and identifying where that information may come from if it already exists. So obviously useful points to call, things like health and safety files, operation and maintenance manuals, etc., regulation 38 information, etc., but making sure obviously that information is up to date, robust, complete, accurate, etc. So important to just basically have that review of the status of your current information, and link the information requirements to the contents of a safety case report. So is it a higher risk building? Is it complex? Has it got the height restrictions? What are your responsibilities and ownership requirements? Have you got drawings, photos, asset registers, tags, etc.? Recent fire risk assessments, liaison with your fire authority, who that fire authority is. Structural safety, I'll come on to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done on large panel system buildings, etc. Data from stock condition surveys and other related health and safety documents. So all that type of information, have you got it? Is it up to date? Can you rely on it? And can it be used as the format for your building safety case? There's also the requirements in terms of providing information, BIM level 2 type information. One of the diagrams on the right is something that our BIM team's been working on in terms of providing that type of information in 3D, and being able to provide and pinpoint certain aspects of a building that are important from a fire safety perspective. So we've been undertaking that along with the fire door inspections that I've mentioned, and identifying those, and also looking at complex mechanical and electrical installations and whether they're asset tagged, etc. So providing that sort of information, and continuing that golden thread, and that may need further surveys to be undertaken, so geospatial type 3D modelling, etc., for high-rise buildings, but those sorts of things quite often aren't in place, so important to sort of start thinking about those sort of aspects now. Structural assessments, key to make sure that we don't forget that the draft build does include structural safety as well as fire. So examination, particularly our structural engineers who've done a lot of work, including the building in that photo, and some are opening up that's shown on the diagram on the photo next to it. So looking at things like large panel systems, but reinforced concrete structures, etc., and ensuring that they have been assessed and have got a good sort of expected future life, and any remedial or ongoing maintenance work continues to be undertaken. We've also done a lot of opening up and cladding and insulation type assessments, including having stuff fire tested at BRE, etc. And particularly with higher risk buildings, making sure you are doing the right types of FRAs. So we recommend intrusive type 4 and compartmentation review as high risk buildings. Simply undertaking a type 1 FRA of a building like that on the right is not going to be sufficient to provide you with the information that you need for a building safety case. So in summary, I think there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to take on board. There's probably a lot of information to review and ascertain in terms of what state it's in, and whether it's going to be sufficient to provide what's needed for building safety cases, as well as the appointment of competent persons, etc. So there's an awful lot to consider, but like any elephant, it's best eaten in small chunks, and sort of a good process and plan to doing that within a fire strategy. But the other thing to bear in mind, obviously, is that it's not all about fire safety at the moment. We have here COVID-19, in case you can't read the wave, all the talk around recessions, etc., which probably at the time this drawing was done, that's probably a smaller wave than it was now in terms of our recovery from the post-COVID pandemic, but also in terms of climate change, net zero carbon, sustainability issues generally, as well as not forgetting, we've got the normal day job to do that we had before all this started, in terms of planning 30-year investment and making sure that our assets are performing well. So in summary, I think a holistic approach. I will finish at that because I've probably taken up too much time anyway, but deal with any questions at the end. So I'd like to now hand over to Ian Taylor, who's the procurement category manager for planned works at PFH, and he's going to give you a brief overview of a current project they've been working on, and outline some of the examples of the procurement challenges you may face in all that I've outlined in terms of requirements, and those sort of possible solutions to you when using the framework. Thank you,
Ian. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm just going to follow on from that with, as Mark said, a bit of a case study from a recent project we've been working on at PFH in one of the London boroughs. As we've seen from the conversation that we've had there with Mark, there's an increasing demand within the sector for contractors to complete fire safety works currently. These demands and the nature of the discovery are extremely time precious due to tenant safety. So just to put things into context, we feel it'd be valuable to offer an insight into a recent project, and by outlining the situation that the PFH member found themselves in the challenges they faced with procurement, and also the solutions that PFH were able to deliver for them. We hope that this will offer you some useful insights that will resonate and hopefully assist you on your own fire safety works and implementation programs. So after engaging with a consultant on our technical services framework, the customer was faced with a large number of schemes that needed cladding removal and replacement. The estimated cost of the works were in the region of £20 million. And not only did the customer need to procure the fire safety works effectively, but they also needed to compliantly award the evolving consultancy works. Working watch was in place at the majority of the schemes, which of course was costing the customer and the tenants money they didn't have. And they'd also been awarded grants to cover the leaseholder costs, or as a result of that, they were working to a very tight deadline. So this left them with quite a challenge. The member needed to comply with procurement regulations, but lacked the resource and time to run a full or due tender of their own. In a high pressure environment, they were counting on external resource and expertise to deliver on time in a compliant and effective manner. Section 20 consultation was required on the majority of the 12 blocks, which prohibited us from procuring certain schemes as quickly as we might like. All of those requiring Section 20 consultation had to be put on hold until that process had been completed in full. And at that point, they were then able to be packaged up into programs of work. The customer had a real appetite to include SMEs in the procurement process who have expertise in works of this nature around the London area and keeping investments in the local community as much as possible. An issue at the moment is that the market is very much in favour of these contractors due to the volume of work available and the fact that there are limited contractors with capacity and expertise to deliver on time whilst also delivering value for money. There are a lot of pressures over skilled labour and the effects on Brexit on contractors' resource for cladding removals, as a lot of the labour force for this work has traditionally been from other parts of Europe, and our departure from the EU is causing issues with capacity in that area. So we needed to help find a solution to these problems for the member. And with Section 20 involved, this meant that frameworks became less attractive, despite our fire safety offers in this area. A big reason for this is that should a leaseholder want to put forward a contractor during this process, you can't add them to a framework once it's been appointed. However, our Capital Works DPS allows contractors to be onboarded at any point, should they have the relevant certification and pass the pre-qualification criteria. This provided that flexibility to support the leaseholder consultation process. Further to this, the DPS had a number of previously awarded contractors, and PFH were able to invite a list of SMEs provided by the customer and the consultants to join the DPS. Flexibility of the DPS allowed for a lean and efficient procurement process, weighted as per the customer's preference, using their chosen specification and pricing schedules. We were able to manage the clarifications process and schedule site visits for bidders with the member. Through using one of our multi-lot consultancy frameworks and the subsequent use of our Capital Works DPS, PFH were able to provide this customer with a 360-degree solution. We were also able to offer advice to both parties on procurement procedure, pitfalls, market concerns, and realistic timelines. The decision was made to release these blocks scheme by scheme where packages weren't an option, and this allowed the works to be procured and awarded as and when ready, meaning the process was as efficient as possible. By working as an efficient partnership with clearly defined roles, PFH were able to bring on board 5 new contractors, provide support with documentation and publishing of tenders, and keep tender timelines on track, with returns typically being ready within 4 weeks. So just to quickly summarise then, members need to be conscious of contractors' resource, not only to take on the work, but to actually tender for it. Market pricing is slipping due to high demand, and we don't envisage that changing anytime soon, really. Being as planned as possible in terms of identifying works via in-house or external consultants and building in time for procurement really is key. Look at a DPS as a flexible route to market when a Section 20 is involved, and when it isn't involved, there are a number of direct award options too available across the sector. Due to the likely large volume of works out to market, there may be some challenges finding contractors for smaller packages. Consider whether they can be grouped or packaged together to leverage value, or perhaps even provide more attractive geography in terms of boundaries. even consider working with neighbouring authorities where your boundaries overlap to help package up those works to make them more attractive to contractors. PFH are happy to help advise and support where possible with any fire safety related procurement. And that's pretty much it from me, really. Just a bit of a whistle-top tour of the kind of thing we're working on, just to try and give some context to the presentation from Ridge. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark and Ian, for that. I've just opened up the Q&A box just to see what questions we've got. I think Mark has started to answer some of them, but Mark, just the first one, it's can you please let us know how high-risk building is defined in the bill?
Yeah, sure. I started just typing the proposed definitions actually within the explanatory notes of the draft bill, paragraph 228. If you want to go straight to it, the building needs to satisfy a number of conditions. First of all, it's 2 or more dwellings, so that's a house, flat, or serviced apartment, and 2 or more rooms for residential purposes, so supported accommodation or student accommodation. So within our sector, it's pretty much applying to any mixed use residential accommodation that we've got. And then the height conditions are the floor surface of the building's top story. So if you're all familiar with Part B requirements in terms of the building regulations, it's that measurement, the finished floor level. So whether that is 18 meters or more above ground level, so that ignores any story which is rooftop plant and machinery, and so it's either 18 meters or more than 6 stories, ignoring any story which is below ground level. So it's that sort of the way we measure the finished floor level when we're doing stock condition survey is a different way to which you may measure the overall height of the building. So it's that finished floor level that is critical, and that was always historically driven by how the fire brigade could get a ladder up to that level, to that sort of ability to rescue people. So once it is above that 18-meter stroke 6-story rule, that's when it becomes a higher risk residential build. A high risk residential building, which is a slight change in definition to what we had with high-rise residential buildings, or HRRBs, before the bill came in. So there is a subtle difference in terms of the what's included within the draft bill.
Great, thanks, Mark. Okay, there's another question there, probably more for you, Ian. What's the most useful thing procurement teams can do to support our building safety stakeholders?
Okay, so I think, yeah, with regard to that, I think flexibility is key. Look at every avenue that's available to you. Don't be too prescriptive in what you're prepared to consider. Be forceful. There may be pressures to rush things, which isn't necessarily the best way to deal with this. You need to give time to properly plan the procurement, to give yourselves the best chance of a good number of returns. The way the bid teams are within contracting organisations at the moment, they're absolutely snowed under. There's more work than there is capacity in the market at the moment, and you've got to consider how attractive your piece of work is to the contractors that you're trying to bring in. I think be prepared to consider direct award options if you can, but speak to suppliers. Speak to organisations like PFH, organisations like Ridge. We're more than happy to have a very general, non-committal conversation around how we can help.
Great, thanks, Ian. Okay, and there's another one there. I think they probably missed part of the presentation, which you will get a copy of the recorded session, but please can you explain section 20 requirements and frameworks versus BPS? I think they missed some of that part of the presentation.
Okay, obviously that was more touched on upon in mine. I'm not going to go into section 20 as a whole, but I will speak about it again in terms of the advantages that a framework versus a DPS can't. One of the requirements within section 20 is that leaseholders, which are obviously quite affected by this, have the right and the ability to recommend contractors they feel could do the work and could offer value for money. If you're looking at using a framework and that organisation isn't already on that framework, then a framework isn't an option for you to accommodate that leaseholder requirement. But with a DPS, a contractor can join that at any time. So if the leaseholders do say, you know, we've come across this organisation, we think they'd be really good to do the work here and we want them to bid, we can work with you to get them on board to our DPS, so that they would be able to bid for that work in a competitive environment.
Great, thanks Ian. I think that's the end of our questions. So yeah, timing's quite good. That concludes the webinar. Thank you all again for joining, and thank you to our speakers. I hope you all found it a useful and informative session. Just to recap, you will each receive an email with a link to the recording and answers to any of the questions that have been asked today. And we'll also provide some contact details for both Ridge and PFH should you wish to discuss anything further with us. So yeah, thanks again for joining and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.